Thank you all. I'm going to begin in the name of God, Bismillahir-Rahim. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. All praise is due to God. I wouldn't be here. I have so much to be grateful for, this book being out and all of you turning up here, and this a beautiful venue. I didn't know what to expect when Nikki kind of managed to pull this off, but like, this is not what I thought it would be. It's absolutely gorgeous. And I'd also just like to send salutations upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam before I begin. Before anything else, I just want to let anyone know who needs to, who hasn't yet, because I would be stressed. If you haven't prayed and you need to, there's a prayer mat that I gave Nikki, so if anyone wants to escape, I won't think you're being rude. So, I'm going to begin with a reading from early on in this book. Something that Imi mentioned and Nikki mentioned was kind of, well, a lot of things were mentioned, but something that felt really pertinent was around imagining and what's possible. And some of you might know some of my work and some of you won't, and I just want to give a little bit of background, literally a few sentences just before I read this section, just to say that prior to this I've sort of, I suppose, written things that are quite obviously overtly political, they're social commentary perhaps, wanting to look at structures and societal change and transformation, racism, imperialism, all of these things. And I think I was just talking earlier to Elilta and Noor about how only once having done that have I felt the ability to turn inwards somewhat. But I think that turning inwards is something that actually is so essential to the imagining of that future that we're trying to do together. And so part of this conversation, I hope tonight, in terms of radical imagining, is how do we allow ourselves to be congruent? And for me, even sort of beginning today with the name of God, that's something I would never have done at a talk, you know, a couple of years ago. And yet that is the reality of who I am. That's a way that I'm trying to live my life. And so what does it mean to bring all of me, even to a space like this? And so, you know, everything that I'm sharing with you today is probably the most vulnerable version of writing that I've done. And I hope that it leads to really, we've been talking for ages and had like absolutely amazing conversation already. So you might miss the best part, but if you haven't, you're in for a treat. So I'm going to read something from early in the book, and then at the end I'll read something from late in the book. And Nikki and Imi or anyone, just tell us what the time is and when you need us to stop, because we have no idea apart from the light of the day. The 19 white IKEA boxes in my room cause me shame. When they are made visible by a friend curiously asking about their presence, I make a joke of their existence. I hide the seriousness of their aspiration behind a self-deprecating comment about being a bit of a hoarder. More truthfully, every note in these boxes, every school exercise book, worn birthday card, torn letter, faded journal, scrawled on envelope, unreadable receipt, and ancient bus ticket is a type of evidence. A type of evidence I cling to. Scraps of life and bureaucracy that bear witness to my living, evidence I have existed. I'm afraid to let on about this in case it becomes obvious how afraid I am to go unseen, in case it becomes obvious how powerful it is to destroy a people's history, how catastrophic it is to leave them believing they are suspended, to eliminate their past, present, and knowledge. I don't keep the boxes in hope of being understood, don't get me wrong. I'm not calling to be made intelligible. Let the destinations of my buses go unknown. Burn the journals upon my death, please. Let my secrets stay with me. But not the fact I had them. Not the fact I wrote them down. Not the fact I went someplace with someone, was recipient to gestures, moments, feelings, others. Not that I was here. So let's move into our little conversation. Yeah, I don't know if either of you want to kind of bounce off that, because we were talking a lot about the boxes and hoarding and these things that others do as well.
So throughout the kind of book, I was a very lucky person and got... Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was very lucky and got to read it beforehand. I had a lovely little PDF and just like devoured the entire thing. And throughout you keep coming back to these boxes, and it's a very tactile kind of return, and you talk a lot about histories and authenticity and being seen, and it's anyway I'm going off on one a bit, but when you kind of came to writing this down, did you feel that it was in that collecting and bringing things together and being a bit of a hoarder, was it a conscious need to have existed, or did you realise what you were doing later on?
I think a bit of both, and I think please feel free to jump in because I know we've got mics now, but please, we're still having a conversation. I think it is a bit of both. I talk about in the book how my mum is also probably a bit of a hoarder. She'll hate me for having said that, but she is. But actually what I try to explore is, well, what does that mean? And what does it mean for people whose histories have often been not really destroyed, I wouldn't say, but have been hidden or stolen or suppressed or sidelined or marginalised or just made inaccessible, or you lose the language to access them. And so I think I've always been aware that there is something political to it, there's something historical to it. It's not just a kind of random thing, because it's not, I think part of that thing of wanting evidence that I have existed. And I think we all were talking about shared interest in kind of history, and that thing about wanting to, you can only understand the things around us today by understanding where they've come from, and wanting to explore other histories that we haven't yet accessed. And I think that's so much of knowing who you are. So I think there is an awareness, but I also think there's probably a level of just like, only later have I been able to apply that consciousness to it. And I think it's maybe something more instinctive than that knowing that, well, why are there no photos of my grandparents? Why can't I, where are their journals? Why can't I go in their attic and find, all of their XYZ things? So I think there's also that instinctive element of like, I want to have those things so someone can see them about me one day. Although we talked about this earlier too, and I was talking about archives and museums and those kinds of things, and how actually I would never want to give my grandparents' things, my parents' things to a museum or an archive, and how there's like an interesting idea that lots of these things have to be institutionalized and systematized. Yeah.
And I think like that's what's really interesting is like later on in the book when you're talking about visiting, like when going back home with your grandma, and you're talking about like none of the buildings are on like Google Maps, or like none of the streets are named, but your grandma kind of like knows them instinctively, like it's kind of like muscle memory. And I think it's really interesting like how you talk about kind of like, obviously like I think we were touching on it a bit earlier on, but when you were talking about how it doesn't all have to be institutionalized, like she doesn't have this written down, or like she doesn't have a map. It's kind of like the community and the people, and it's like really interesting to see how like memory and history kind of like, and who you share that history with kind of changes, because like you're also talking about how when you would ask her about like specific things, she wouldn't necessarily give you like full description. She'll just be like, oh, we all did that, as the thing, we just did it. And it's not like focusing so much, you're not making yourself the individual. And I also like, I think that's one of the most interesting things as well, like the idea of like who's a subject and who's an object in history, like whose stuff are we taking and then telling people about, and who's able to like tell their own narratives.
Yeah, so one of the things I realised only while I was writing the book was that my grandparents don't care about any of this obsession that I have with like hoarding stuff, and with like, so what Elilta's talking about is I kind of talk about going to Pakistan for 3 months with my grandma, and I wrote 600 pages of journal in that time, and she was just like, what are you doing? Like, there's literally nothing's happening. And I found that like, well, nothing, she thinks nothing's happening. But like, I think there was something in that about what I learned. Well, when I was writing the book, I thought the thing to take from that was that, like I'm so, there's kind of this burden, responsibility or feeling that I have to kind of memorialize these things that she deems not that worth memorializing. But I also think there was a secondary realization, which was that there's also a wisdom in her way of not memorializing, right? And like how much trauma that would require to be held. But also I think maybe we were talking about the differences between kind of being like first gen, second gen and things like that, and how sometimes our relationships to places and spaces are almost forced to be possessive, that we feel we must make a claim that we belong to. But actually how there's such a freedom in kind of being like, I don't belong here, there, anywhere, like wherever I end up. My grandma's always just like, oh, I still don't know the land I'll die in. I'm like, that's like, wow, yeah, true. But also that's just such a laissez-faire like approach to this question that seems to be, everyone's at each other's throats about whether they do or don't belong somewhere. But I think it was only in the writing that I was kind of like, actually, yeah, there's something in that actually I should or could take from, that I think also speaks to them when I'm kind of in the book, I get a bit bored of myself in the book, and I'm kind of like, what's beyond all of this? And I think that's where I think seeing like elders and other people's approaches has kind of led me to thinking that maybe, you know, maybe answers weren't in kind of just being seen or seeking others' sight.
Like another thing I find really interesting, like when you start off the book, when you're talking about like gaze and like who's seen and who's the watcher, and like who are we gazing upon, who's the subject, who's the object. And what I really enjoy is like when you break down the binaries that we have about like sight, and because obviously it's our main sense, isn't it? So like we're all very focused on it, and we're all very focused on what we can see, and we're like, who are we perceiving, and what are we perceiving, and in what context are we perceiving? And it's like that's been like the focus of academia recently, where it's like, oh, how are we perceiving contexts? How are we perceiving manuscripts? Where do they come from? But when you like break that down and you say like, but like, what do we feel? Like, what is like? I think you mentioned the heart's eye. Like, what do we feel? Like, why are we looking? Like, what is the purpose of all of this? I think that's like one of the most interesting things in the book.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that I'm glad you picked up on that, because I think that also for me was what felt most interesting. It was just like, I think, I hope, and you know, perhaps you don't, but I feel like we probably all share some level of fatigue over like the representation stuff, conversations. I feel like, whilst on the one hand, yeah, representation's rubbish, I also feel I'm done with. I don't need any more done. Yeah, I'm past that. And what I'm being a bit, you know, facetious about that. But what I mean is that I think it's what Elilta's saying, that I realise that there is. What I mean, if you take it to its furthest logic, like where is it that we're trying to get to in terms of this being seen and being seen in the right way? Because you know, we often end up either that it's that the representation is not. It's not accurate enough, it's too overgeneralized, or oh no, it's too specific and not everyone's being seen now. And I think it just led me to this kind of question of, well, where is, if you take that logic to its furthest conclusion, has it changed our outcomes in any way? Is anybody safer? Is anybody, you know, are we still being deported? Are we still, you know, increasing our numbers in prison? Of whatever it is, are our life chances any different? And so I think, outwardly, if I was to have that conversation on a panel, or if I was to write it in a different book, I would probably end the sentence there. But where I then go in this book, and where I'm kind of interested to go then, is to say, what I then did was close my eyes, right? And to say, I'm sick of being seen, actually, and I'm sick of seeing and representing. And I think, and I say this as someone, I guess, who, you know, having sort of a public platform to some degree, and knowing, you know, I know the emails I get where you've not read my work, you just want the image of this hijab wearing woman on your event or whatever it is. And, you know, but it was kind of the question of, when I close my eyes, when I'm alone, actually I feel seen. And that really surprised me. I was like, well, hang on, this goes against all the logic of, you know, representational discourse. And for me, it was undeniable, and it felt like I was censoring myself to not say that is because of my faith. It's solely because when I'm alone, I don't believe I'm alone. And so we talked about, you know, I guess for me it was like moving from this horizontal plane of perception to like a vertical plane, not to kind of limit it to verticality, but to think about, what does it mean to feel seen when no one is seeing you? What? I suppose the question is, what possibilities does it open for us in terms of imagining different worlds, different futures, different forms of, whether it's anti-racism or structural change or transformation, if our paradigm expands beyond just the perceivable with the eyes? And so we were talking about the eye of the heart, and you know, this is a huge thing in Islamic literature and spirituality, and actually what possibilities are offered to us by bringing that lens to our approach to structural change. When we're talking about our communities, we're talking about gentrification, when we're talking about prisons, like that can all be so, we can think and we can be constrained into thinking that that's so separate from those conversations about, you know, awakening our hearts, or the eye of the heart, or any of those things. But in reality, what would happen if we brought all those things together congruently? That was what I began to be really excited by when I was writing this. And I suppose I don't have the answer, but it's the question that is exciting to me, and it's kind of a way of living that I'm hoping to do more and more. And I think it's one that perhaps I have thought I am doing, but in reality, am I, is the question for myself.
So at the very, can you, like, okay. So at the very beginning, you talk about like responsibility and how it's a bit boring, but you know, you believe in like needing to hold yourself accountable and things like that, and art having to have purpose. And so you're very honest about how, like, the reason you're writing, and it's, you know, you weren't necessarily having to write this book for yourself. It was like, okay, I'm being told to write something, I'm going to write. Were you kind of thinking of, in writing, you come across it's very sort of, it's a very natural voice, and it kind of feels like being in your own head a bit. It's a very personal truth, which is what makes it so, like, refreshing to read, you know. Sorry, I feel like I'm waffling a bit.
No.
What kind of headspace were you in terms of it being received? Because it was written to be published, right? It wasn't just like, I'm writing in my diary now.
Yeah, so this is like a whole kind of mental breakdown that I have in the middle of the book. Because I'm having a really lovely time, having all these thoughts that I've just shared with you. And then I'm like, oh, well, right, yeah, of course, this is actually supposed to be published. And I just decided the only way to do that was to be very open in the book about that. And I kind of said that, you know, there are all these ways, and I talk particularly about, because I think early on when I was writing the book, I thought I was writing a book about, well, I thought I was writing something really novel and clever, and then I realised it was just writing the same book, that it was like trying to do another version of that book that's probably been done however many times, that's about double consciousness, right? So you have like, you would probably cite Frantz Fanon, you would cite Audre Lorde, you would cite like Yasser and Morsi. It was just like another version of, and which is not to say that that's not worthwhile, but it was just to be like, why am I doing, like, and also what does it say about the fact that writers can be writing these same books for like 50, 60, 70 years, like, where are we going? And so I then kind of, went on this pursuit that I went on, but I also realised that the only way to, I suppose I'm talking about all this stuff to do with like, you know, the eye of the heart and da-da-da. But ultimately, you know, in Islam, like one of the first things that the scholars say undermines your intentions is an audience. Everything I write is read by an audience. Everything, I mean, apart from everything I don't share, which is a lot more. And so I found that really like difficult, because it was like, how do I then navigate that? I'm trying to write something really truthful, but can I even be honest about being truthful when being honest about being honest is really hard? And I don't know whether I've been successful. And, you know, even as I'm talking to you now, that's a question that remains. But I think the point is not whether I've been successful or not. I think what I tried to land on was that I suppose my intention sometimes cannot even be known to myself, right? It can't be known, but I think it did help to lift a bit of the relief, in the sense that I think this book, I'm less concerned about how people receive it in terms of, oh, it's good or it's bad, and more in terms of, did it evoke you to also want to pursue another possibility? And so, because I guess what I realized is these are the cards I've been dealt with. You know, alhamdulillah, like I'm able to share my work with people, but also like, it's horrific. like it's you know, I'm constantly just like, what do I you know, is this? And I think that's why I have a mental breakdown in the middle of the book. But it's all resolved in the end. It's not really. It's ongoing, but. I think it's really important. I think what's frustrating me is that I barely read. I feel like this is not something that writers has acknowledged. It's not something that's said openly and expressed. That like, of course, I'm performing a version of myself when I'm writing this book. It's not. You know, that's like kind of censored. You don't say that. And so, I'm not saying that I didn't, but I'm saying that I tried to be honest about the fact that I was.
I think like one of the most, I guess it's because I also have a history with debating, but when you were talking about how when you're in a debate, like the truth is kind of dependent on whatever you need it to be. Like you're not intentionally lying, but being honest is like really difficult when you're trying to convey like a message, when you're trying to say something. The truth is not necessarily like the thing that you're focusing on. And by centering being honest and by centering kind of like exploration, do you think that maybe that it kind of allows for because like what I found is like it feels like you said, like we're in your head, and I feel like maybe I don't know, one of the things that I found really interesting was the fact that like it is an experience with you. It's not necessarily you coming out of the gate with a prologue saying this is what I want to tell you about and this is why it's important. It's like a exploration of like why we are going on this journey, like why we're setting out on this exploration. And I feel like that's what allows it to be like a lot more personal and a lot less like, oh, I'm telling you things about my life that are necessary for you to understand this point I'm making, which is a lot of like when you get like narratives about like because I do philosophy, like when philosophers talk about their philosophies, they'll kind of be like, oh, and this is my credibility, like this is why I can talk about this, but you're not necessarily saying that. You're like, this is my journey, and like because of where I come from, this journey makes sense. Like this journey is from this perspective because of me.
It's really good to hear that, because I think one thing I was really worried about is like, I didn't want this to feel like a memoir, because I'm just like, come on, like look at me, I'm a baby, I don't have anything to say. But I also wanted it to be personal. I wanted to be able to like share some realities that are mine, and so. But I think, like Noor said earlier, like I just felt really also, like I don't believe in arts for art's sake, I just don't. And so I also felt like there had to be a reason to share. I can't just be out here like, I had a really nice walk with my grandma one time. And so, yeah, so I think the thing of, so I talk in the book, there's one point, one essay where I talk about, that thing about truth being this collateral. And I remember being really inspired when I came across this, Imam Shafi'i, who's one of the great imams of Islam, there's a quote from him that he said that whenever he engaged in a debate with anybody, he would pray that the truth would manifest, whether it was on his tongue or his opponent's tongue, he didn't mind. And I found that, again, such a paradigmatic shift from the way that we think about conversation, where it's like, you know, you're really trying to prove to your interlocutor that like, I'm cleverer, I'm smarter, I'm wittier, I'm more savvy, I'm more funny, whatever. And it was just like, no, actually, what would it mean to be more committed to the truth than to the self? Again, not something at all that I can really relate to or only aspire to, but I think that it was something that made me think about, I maybe don't have any truths of my own to offer, but I have a belief in truths that I take from others around me, and I hope that they could be conveyed. But yeah, again, I think it's like this constant thing of masking and unmasking, masking and unmasking. And I think it also required really having to write against the narrative of secularism as a narrative that makes sense. And this is something we were talking about earlier, that, you know, it's so hard to come congruently to even like an industry like publishing when there are certain expectations and markers of, you know, intelligence or good writing or whatever. And I even think it's interesting, and it's not something conscious, but I think it's interesting that it's taken for me to kind of have a couple of books under my belt to go, okay, now bismillah, do you know what I mean? And that's interesting to me. Like, what does it mean? There's a type of legitimacy that's required in order to prove, okay, you can speak the language of the academics, you can speak the language of the artists, you can speak the language of the poets, and now you're kind of thrown as you're speaking your own language, but it's too late. You're in. Do you know? Like, I do wonder if there's something in that. And we were talking a lot about secularism earlier. I don't know if you guys want to like say anything about those things.
Academia is always like, we're not here to focus on God. We're not here to focus on spirituality. It's like we're purely secular. Where we want to talk about science, we want to talk about philosophy, and we want it to be completely removed. And it's like, even when we do say these things, it's like our secularism is so Western that it's like, it's kind of like rooted in this idea of like a Judeo-Christian God, and like this the belief systems that come with it, even if it's implicit. And it's really interesting to see that, like, not only are you breaking that down, but you're bringing a new thing, and obviously that's implicit to you. And so I don't know if you're doing this on purpose. Like, that's a question I had. Like, I don't know if you were bringing all this up like on purpose. It's like, I don't see this getting focused on enough, or whether it was sort of like the same way that like the things that Descartes writes about are implicit to him, they're also implicit to you. And so obviously you bring them up, even though that's not necessarily the focus of your exploration.
Yeah, I think it probably was more conscious than Descartes. But I think that's just because being in the position of marginality, where your belief system, faith system, whatever you want to call it, is not deemed the norm. I think it makes it easier to be more critical about then bringing that to the fore, and like, but saying that, it wasn't something conscious in the sense of like, I'm going to write a book where I talk about being Muslim. It was more that I was like, genuinely, and if you read the book, you'll see I'm just genuinely like, there is nothing else for me to say. The only thing I can now say is, if I'm feeling unseen, okay, so I kind of go on this logic to break it down really quick. I'm like, okay, I want to be seen. I want to be seen for myself. Okay, maybe I could see myself for myself if no one else can see me for myself. Oh, well, I can't really see myself for myself because there has to be something I'm in relation to. Okay, what am I in relation to? It's not whiteness? Okay, no, is it not? Is it you? No, is it me? And eventually, as I said, I was exhausted, closed my eyes, and it's like, one of the names of God in Islam is Al-Basir, the all-seeing, the completely encompassing sight, the sight that is, unique and whole in a way that we can't even comprehend, a sight that can see sound, that can see, and I think that was really interesting to me because it was like, so to answer the question, it was like, I have to explore that. It's not like, oh, this is like, I'm going to kind of go out my way to fit this and wedge this into the book. It was just like, this is the only thing left. Otherwise, this book is going to be utterly boring and replicate like every conversation I've ever had in my life. Sorry, that sounds really dismissive, but it just felt like this is the only avenue I've not been allowed to explore. And it's the only one that I think offers hope as well, because it was just like, I don't want to have conversations that always just end in like critique and despair and I think, alhamdulillah, I feel like I am quite a hopeful person. And even the last book I wrote about Islamophobia, I was really pleasantly surprised that people were like, oh, I actually didn't feel really awful when I finished the book because it wasn't, it's not the best picture, is it? But I do think so much of that comes from my faith. So it was like, well, then let me be honest about that. So yeah, it was deliberate, but it was also just kind of inevitable. Otherwise, I don't think I would have felt like it was a bit of a wasted book. Otherwise, to be quite honest, because I don't think I had, like I said, I don't think I have anything. I don't have anything left to say. I'm just a baby. I don't know anything. Don't make me say stuff.
So back to the boxes. There's this thing about just something that's been touched, and like hands as a symbol of history, and like your history being written on the palm of your hands, your fingerprint being like, even like the shape that your hands take, whether they're your grandmother's hands or someone's, and then things being passed from one person to another, be that stories, or like when you talk about like the oral tradition and like wanting to have it written down, but then at the same time is that removing from its, like, I don't know, is that taking away from its beauty and its being so individual to every person? I don't know if you wanted to talk a bit more about.
Yeah. I mean, Noor was saying something really beautiful about hands earlier, in particular, just about kind of when we share things with our hands, how that feels really important. And I talk in the book about. I think when I've moved into that space of like not necessarily seeing with sight, but seeing in other ways. One of the things the book is loads about my grandparents, which I didn't expect it to be either. But one of the things I talk about is I don't know how, but I've become responsible now for trimming my granddad's beard. So yeah, I'm like really proud of that. It's probably one of the best things that I've achieved so far. But the first time I did it, I just realised that I had never actually been that close to my granddad physically, and also not really to any men in my family. And I feel like with women, maybe there are rituals that you might, I don't know, maybe whether it's plaiting someone's hair or massaging someone's legs or whatever it is. But like, especially to an elder man in my family. And I had this moment of like it was really visceral. I remember, and I just was really surprised that his cheeks were soft, which sounds really silly, but I was just like, I remember thinking, oh, you're someone's baby too? And again, maybe it sounds silly, but it was just this moment of like, it felt really intimate. It felt really, really intimate, and it was really embodied. It was really physical, but also it was not at the same time. And I think, we were talking earlier about how kind of, what's the impact of living in a society where we can't talk about the fact that we're more than bodies. We can't talk about the fact that we are souls. And I think, it's these, I focus on these micro moments of like intimacy and love, and probably a lot of that is familial in my experience, because they open up to me and show to me that we're so much more than those moments, and those moments carry so much meaning only because they are not what we're limited to. And I think in particular I talk about my granddad as he ages and things, that there are ways that his mind might not be the mind that it once was, but that has actually enhanced, if anything, I would say, the bond that we have. And that kind of defies the logic we have around, I don't know, communication and intelligence and again, it's like the mind-body element. If you remove that, if you take someone who's, you know, very elderly and perhaps both of those things are not as present or as workable, you know, to take ableist language as they should be or could be or have been, then by rights you would assume what's left is nothing. You know, well, what's the point? There's nothing to communicate over here. But if anything, I would say my relationship with my granddad now it feels paradigmatically different, and it feels that it exists on another plane. And I think that is partly because he is in a different plane than the plane I'm in some senses. And so what does it mean then to kind of know that, but then to deny that in the ways that we talk about one another, or to have it limited to language that is just like medicalizing, I suppose.
Like, you guys won't have read the book yet, but throughout the book, like you do the like act 1, act 2 kind of structure, and I really enjoyed that because like when you start, you break it up with these moments of like these characters, and it's this writer and this book, and like what I think is most interesting is like how you add to that as you go throughout, and it kind of adds to this idea of like oral storytelling and like the idea of like history not necessarily just being like a linear story that we like, there were like this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and there's no other way to tell that story. It's like you even if you center it from the middle, you're still telling act 1, act 2, act 3, and you're not necessarily like adding to it the same way you would with like oral storytelling. So like how do you try and navigate that when you're telling the story of like your grandparents or like your family or like you? How do you kind of like attempt to tell a story in a book that for people to follow, it kind of has to be linear, but it itself isn't?
Yeah, I think I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think that I find that something really difficult as well. I mean, initially Hydra Press asked me if I wanted to write a novel, and I just felt like I couldn't. I was just like, oh, this seems too hard. But instead I kind of like have included little bits of different things in there, and one of the things is what has been mentioned is like, I suppose like scenes, you could say scenes, and they don't necessarily, I mean, they don't necessarily go in the order that they're in. They could be in a different order, but like I think the reason I include, so just to kind of give some context for what you mentioned in case it doesn't make sense, just that, so initially there's a scene and it's between the writer and the book, and they're kind of, you know, having this conversation, and then in the next scene that comes up is the same conversation, but there are now other characters, her heart, her head, her soul, her mind, and there's like this element of repetition, but in the repetition we're actually, I think for me it's about transparency again. It goes back to that thing of I'm just lifting that veil a bit more and I'm trying again and just saying like, you know, there's more going on here. And I think maybe I think there's so much that could be said about that question, and I don't think I'm really best placed to answer it, but I do think that something I've learned about storytelling from my elders is they tell the same story again and again and again if you're not listening. You think it's the same story again and again and again, but it's not the same story again and again and again. And I think for me there's something in that the words and the narrative might be the same, but even the fact that it's being told again, it feels to me like there's something really important in the fact that a story is told twice, and the fact of the repetition. At some level, to me, like actually, and I talk about this as well in the book, but at some point, really, I'm only more interested in how you remember it than the reality. So, and there's this kind of contradiction, I guess, because yes, I want the evidence, yes, I want the proof, I want your books and your journals and your passport, but I also only really care about how you recall it, and who do you, like, you know, do you remember the way that they looked at you, and do you remember how it felt, and it doesn't really, like, the fact element of the memory is less important, which is kind of ironic, because they're the things that I cling onto, but I think sometimes that push and pull and that contradiction is also just at the heart of, you know, maybe trying to understand what love is as well and how we express that.
I'm glad you brought up the scene thing, because one of my favourites is when you kind of almost break the fourth wall, and there's a conversation between 5 just people, random people, and then it's like, oh, but who is the audience? And it's kind of, it came across as very much a reflection of like being seen and subjectivity and objectivity, and who gets to determine like who is and isn't a subject or an object, and kind of like in breaking that down, did you want it to, was that an experiment, or were you trying to emulate something, like subconsciously emulating things, where you were talking about are you rewriting fanon or are you doing something for yourself?
Yeah, well, actually, that particular thing you mentioned, it was directly, and I have put in the book as well, it's inspired by the play Fairview by Jackie Sibbles Drury, which is really clever, and essentially the third act, so I won't get into the whole thing, go read it, but in the third act, all the white members of the audience are invited up onto the stage, and it's this really awkward moment of the fourth wall being broken, and obviously no one wants to do it, and they're like, ha ha ha, and then, but they have to, it's part of the play. But it's, so I was really directly inspired by that. And actually there's loads of, and I try to cite them as much as possible, loads of people who have been inspired by it. It's just that they're not necessarily, post-colonial theorists or whatever. And in fact, I'm doing an event in London on Friday, and the person who I wanted to host it, my friend, she rang me and she was like, look, Suhaiymah, I don't know if I can talk about this book. I'll be honest, I've never read Bell Hooks books. I just say that I have. Yeah, and I was like, no, she didn't say I just say that I have. She was like, I've read the title, I flicked through it. I was like, who hasn't? We've all done that. It's fine, relax. But what it made me think about with those, I was like, that's exactly the problem. Like, we have this whole canon that we all pretend is like inspiring to us and that we're beholden to and that we must use it and we must cite it. But actually, I was like, when I was just reading the book on the train now, I can't even remember what I'd written about. I was really shocked that it was so much about my grandparents. And I was like, they are my canon. They are my fanon. They are my Audrey. Why am I citing people that I've never met when I have like my own people to cite? And that's not in any way to kind of downplay the impact of those people's writing and ideology and ideas, but it's also to say that, in reality, who influences the way we think and we speak and we love. And like I say, I'm more interested in how we love, to be honest. I'm more interested in how we love than how we think. And I think that, obviously that's a bit of a false binary, but I do think that focusing on the heart gives me a different canon.
I think I just wanted to ask how you balance being the narrator just by the sheer person of like being the person who wrote the book, and also being kind of like the subject, or like you are also the subject of the things that you are writing about, or like at least related to it. Like, how do you balance that?
How do I balance that? I'm not sure. I'm not sure actually. That's an interesting question, because I guess I don't think I necessarily saw it like that, or like a balance. I think I saw it more as, I see it more as narrative, and I think that I'm telling you stories about other people. But you're right, they're all stories about me ultimately. Like, because that's what I was saying earlier, right? Like these are just my versions of those events. But I think I felt less preoccupied with balancing that as I did with trying to get somewhere else away from myself. And near the end of the book, I kind of say, the irony of the book is how many times have I said I and me and my, like, it's impossible, and it feels impossible to me, and mashallah, there are some people who it's not impossible for, but it was kind of a thing of like, I guess wanting to actually get away from that balance, even get away from myself, right away from myself, and that thing again of closing my eyes, and seeing what else I could find. So sorry, that's not a very good answer, but I think I was trying to move away from that, but I didn't successfully.
Bringing it back to the land that we're in and the trees, you kind of close with, I think I wrote it down. You talk about when the trees bear witness about me, and being like, what is it to be a steward of the earth and things like that, in relation to like Islamic tradition, and how you're no longer shying from within your own writing and what you're sharing. It feels much more like you've just embraced that which you are. How do you feel that you can hold yourself accountable and be responsible as a creative person when discussing, like real-time events and things happening out, like playing out in a bigger kind of sense, as opposed to your own individual thing?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think I have been thinking a lot about the things I've written previously, and I don't think I would talk about those things differently, but I think what I'm aware of is, let's just take an example. Like when I have held conversations around my book about Islamophobia, people often want to know or think or ask, like, what can I do? What do I do? What do we do next? Like, how do we fight this? How do we resist it? And I think something that this book has helped me to embrace more, and I think I already was thinking along those lines, but it's just, we have to start with ourselves. And that sounds so trite, and it sounds so, like, non-radical, but I kind of mean it in the opposite sense, and I mean it in the sense of radical root change. I mean, I think Civic Square is a fantastic example of, like, it's so incremental. It can feel, I suppose, at times mundane and, like, just so personal and intimate. But I think that's right. And I think when you look at, like, the early companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, you see that it took 23 years for them to become the companions that we talk about today. When you might hear people talk about, you know, names like Abu Bakr, Umar, and I think that the fact that it takes 23 years to become a person like that, we often forget that. I think we want that revolution, like, today, right now. And I think, yeah, that again, don't take this for political quietism. I'm not saying that we can't empty the prisons tomorrow. We can. We can empty the detention centres. They did that when COVID happened in Spain. I think they just emptied their detention centres. You can do that, but I'm talking more about, when we're talking about addressing the root causes of things, you have to have a societal paradigmatic shift in understanding, and I think that has to entail changing ourselves, and I think we all have egos, and we all want to believe that we're right, myself very much included in that. And I think that it also requires being wrong many times, and that's very personal, and that can feel very personal. So I think maybe the impact of this book and that kind of inner outer thing is in trying to, like, close the gap between the inner and the outer, is just, I guess, allowing more space for more of it, more complexity, more, like, having many opinions that might seem contradictory, but I think can be congruent if given the right context. Yeah, so for the sake of time, I'm thinking, should I just end with that reading that we talked about? So we picked out a reading that, I kind of said, how should I read this, guys? I'm inspired. But this comes much later in the book, and I guess it speaks to the thing of radical possibilities and change and imagining, because what we were talking about, and I hope maybe has come through in some of this conversation, is that I am really excited about, for myself, but also for anyone who, you know, feels that it invites them to do the same in this book, that if we allow ourselves the full possibility of all the knowledges that we hold and possess and have access to, you know, we really, really and truly might be able to begin to build something that we want to build. So this is an essay that comes kind of after the whole breakdown and everything, and now I'm like, okay, I get it, I know what I want to do. That happens again later in the book, though. Again, it's not a linear breakdown. In the second Hijri year, 624 AD, between 313 and 317 of the first Muslims gathered in the valley of Badr in the Arabian Peninsula against a force of around 1,000 from the Quraysh clans who sought to destroy them and their subversive religion. The Muslims were incredibly ill-equipped for fighting, and thus the non-Muslim forces assumed they would win an easy victory. But in the end, the Meccan forces were overpowered by the smaller force, and the reason for this victory, as agreed by both sides, was the presence of angels. An army of 3,000 angels was sent by Allah to fight with the Muslims at Badr. In many reports of the battle, both Muslims and non-Muslim eyewitnesses recount seeing unknown horsemen whose hooves did not touch the ground, or hearing voices urging them forward, or seeing the enemy flee from ones other than themselves. It probably reflects badly on me to admit that in my childhood, my imagining of this battle was made most vivid after I watched The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King, in which Aragorn arrives to save the day with an army of glowing green ghosts, an army of the dead. Of course, angels are not dead men, but the presence of invisible, invincible forces that smite the enemy on behalf of our protagonists made the stories seem similar when I was a child. I know this comparison will reinforce the disbelief of some readers. I understand some will balk at the idea of angels assisting in a battle, indeed at the idea of angels at all. But I also know that I believe in even stranger stories than this one, and that you, dear reader, do too. For instance, I know someone who was never very good with deadlines. Neither was he particularly religious at the time, so on the eve of a major deadline, when he stayed up well into the night, it fell to his mother to pray for him. She prayed to Allah to send angels to bolster the boy in his final hours of writing. Just as an army of angels was sent to the Battle of Badr, she asked that they be sent now to a bedroom in the north of England. By the morning, not having told her son of this prayer, she checked in on him and found him reviewing what he'd written, impressed with himself. He said he almost felt as if he hadn't written it. At some level, in fact, he did not remember writing through the night at all. He was sure that, gripped by exhaustion, he had just slumped at his desk. But reading over the work, he was amazed at the writing. The argument was more cogent and lucid than he'd imagined. It didn't even sound like him, he said. And so the mother told him the truth of her supplication. Now, whether angels did or did not write the student's undergraduate dissertation does not concern me. What astounds me is that a boy who had been so skeptical of faith up until then was genuinely of the opinion that a host of invisible forces could have written his dissertation, and that a mother held her child's dissertation to be a cause deserving of angels. The angels are not the most unbelievable part of this story. It is the bewildering, invisible force of love and care that a mother had for a child, and the inconceivable change of heart that a young man experienced overnight. For which is more improbable? That angels aided a boy to write, or that one day he would have mocked the very idea of angels, and the next he could concede that they were possible authors of his work? Whichever answer you land on, I guarantee that you probably believe in something even stranger. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Thanks to Noor and Elilta.